Saren had not planned to attend her own undoing. But here she stood, third row from the altar, watching the man the moon had made for her press his lips to her sister's mouth. The wedding hall of Greyvolt Keep was suffocating. Garlands of white anemone hung from the iron chandeliers, their petals trembling in the warm updraft from 100 candles. This scent should have been lovely. Instead, it crawled into Saren's lungs like smoke and settled there thick and wrong. Kaelin's hand cradled Melis's jaw as he kissed her. Gentle, reverent, the way he had never once touched Saren. The crowd erupted into applause. Saren's hands stayed at her sides, her nails biting into her palms hard enough to leave crescents in the skin. She could feel the bond in her chest, that invisible thread the moon had woven between her soul and Kaelin's, the night she turned 18. And it was fraying, not breaking cleanly. Fraying like rope dragged across stone, each fiber snapping with a dull, sickening pain radiated through her ribs and settled behind her sternum like a bruise she couldn't press. Melis turned from the altar, radiant in ivory silk, her auburn hair crowned with winter jasmine. Her gaze swept the crowd with practiced grace, acknowledging the well-wishers, the nobility, the foreign delegates. And then her eyes found Seren. Her sister smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not the smile of a bride overcome with joy. It was precise, deliberate. A smile that said, "I know exactly what I've taken from you, and I want you to know that I know." Seren's vision blurred. She blinked hard, refusing to let a single tear fall in front of these people. Not here. Not where the whispers were already circling like vultures. She could hear them even now. Poor thing. Did you know she was his true mate? Tragic, really. But what did she expect? A foundling taken in out of charity, thinking she could hold a bond against a woman like Melis. She needed to leave. She needed air and stone walls between her and this spectacle, and she needed them now, before the fraying bond pulled something loose inside her that she could not put back. Seren took a step backward toward the doors and walked directly into a wall of a man. She stumbled, caught herself and looked up, then kept looking up, because the person she had collided with was unreasonably tall, broad-shouldered in a way that blocked the candlelight entirely. Dressed in black from collar to boot, with dark hair cut short, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the keep itself, King Theron Ashvane stood behind her, and Seren's heart simply stopped. The Alpha King of Valdren did not attend weddings. Everyone knew this. He was a myth, wrapped in military reports, a warlord who had unified 3 territories through a combination of strategic brilliance and a reputation so fearsome that entire packs surrendered rather than face him. He did not make social appearances. He certainly did not stand in the third row of a minor lord's wedding ceremony in the northern reaches of his own kingdom. And yet here he was, looking down at Seren, with eyes the color of deep winter pale gray verging on silver, utterly unreadable. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," Seren whispered, her voice barely functional. He didn't respond. His gaze moved from her face to the altar, to Kaelin and Melis receiving congratulations, then back to Seren. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, not curiosity. Something she couldn't name. The bond beneath her ribs gave another sickening lurch, and Seren pressed her hand to her sternum without thinking. The king's eyes tracked the movement. "You are the sister," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Quiet, like the deep note of a bell struck once and left to resonate. Seren's throat closed. "Yes, Your Majesty, the true mate. It wasn't a question." Seren felt the words land like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to respond, to deny it, to minimize it, to say something that would make this less humiliating. But nothing came out. The hall was growing louder around them. The celebration was building, music starting, voices rising, and the bond was screaming. The king extended his hand. "Stand beside me," he said. Seren stared at his hand, then at his face. "What?" "Stand beside me," he repeated. She could not process the words. They didn't belong in the same sentence, in the same reality, as what was currently happening to her. The Alpha King of Valdrin was not asking a nobody bookbinder from the northern provinces to stand beside him at her own sister's wedding. But his hand remained extended, steady and unhurried, and his silver eyes held hers without wavering. The whispers had stopped. The entire hall had gone quiet because people had noticed. They had noticed the king who never attended anything, standing in the third row and offering his hand to the jilted sister. Seren could feel every single gaze in the room settle on her like a physical weight. Melis's smile had vanished. Seren looked at the king's hand. She looked at her sister's face. She looked at Kaelin, who had gone pale, his mouth slightly open, his arm still around his new bride. Then she placed her hand in the king's. His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused and impossibly steady, and the pain in her chest eased, not vanished, not healed, but eased, like a wound that had been exposed to air for the first time in hours. She gasped, startled by the sudden relief. The king's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had felt something too. He turned, guiding her forward through the crowd, and the sea of bodies parted before him without a word. Seren walked beside the Alpha King through the wedding hall of Greyvault. Keep her hand in his, her heart hammering, her mind a blank white roar of confusion and terror, and something else she could not name. Something warm. Something that had no business existing in the wreckage of this day. Behind them, Melis's voice rang out, sharp and brittle. What is the meaning of this? The king did not turn around, neither did Seren. The antechamber was cold and smelled of dust and disuse. A forgotten room adjacent to the hall, all bare stone, and a single narrow window that let in a blade of gray afternoon light. The king released her hand and stepped back, putting distance between them with a precision that felt almost military. Seren's hand tingled where his had been. The relief was already fading, the pain of the fraying bond creeping back like water through cracks. Sit, the king said, gesturing to a bench beneath the window. Seren sat. Not because she wanted to obey, but because her legs were shaking so badly that standing was no longer a reliable option. "What just happened?" she asked. Her voice came out thin and reedy, nothing like her own. The king didn't sit. He stood near the door, his arms crossed, his posture rigid. Up close, away from the candlelight and the crowd, she could see things she hadn't noticed before. A tightness around his eyes that spoke of chronic pain. A slight tilt to his head as though he were straining to hear something just beyond his range. The way his gaze, for all its intensity, seemed to focus a fraction too slowly when she moved. "Your bond," he said. "It's rejecting the severance." Seren blinked. "I know that. I can feel it." "What you're feeling will get worse," he continued, his tone flat and clinical. "An unwilling rejection without the proper rites can damage the wolf. You know this." She did. Every shifter child grew up, hearing the cautionary tales. Rejected mates who lost their wolves entirely, who went hollow, who wasted away because the bond was never meant to be torn. "I'll survive," Seren said, "because that was what you said when you had no other option." The king studied her. That, too, slow focus again, his silver eyes narrowing slightly like he was trying to see her through fog. "Perhaps," he said. Then, without warning, "What is your name?" "Seren. Seren Leaf." The surname was borrowed, given to her by the keep's steward when she'd been left on the castle steps as an infant. Leith, because the steward's mother had been a Leith, and someone had to name the baby. "And your occupation?" "I'm a bookbinder, apprenticed to the palace bindery at Greyvault." A brief, unreadable expression crossed his face. "A bookbinder," he repeated. "Is that a problem?" "No." A pause. "I'll send my beta to speak with you tomorrow." Seren's stomach dropped. "Why?" The king moved toward the door. because I find myself in need of assistance, and you may be suited to provide it. What kind of assistance? He stopped with his hand on the door. For the first time, she saw something behind the mask. Just a flash, quick and raw, before he locked it away again. Exhaustion, profound and terrible exhaustion. The kind that requires discretion, he said. Oren will find you in the morning. Do not leave the keep. He was gone before she could respond. The door closed heavily behind him, and Seren sat alone in the cold antechamber, with her shaking hands in her splintering bond, and the phantom warmth of his fingers still lingering against her palm. She replayed the moment, over and over, his hand extended. Stand beside me, the way the pain had eased when he touched her, the way his jaw had tightened as though he'd felt the same inexplicable thing. That night she lay awake in her narrow room in the bindery quarters and pressed her palm flat against her chest. The bond to Kaling was still there, still raw, still pulling. But beneath it, faint and strange and entirely new, something else hummed like a second thread had been laid alongside the first. Quiet and warm and waiting, she told herself it was nothing. She told herself that kings did not form bonds with bookbinders. She told herself that whatever had happened in that hall was political, or charitable, or simply the whim of a powerful man who answered to no one. She almost believed it. The morning came gray and wet, rain streaking the windows of the bindery in long diagonal lines. Seren had slept perhaps an hour, maybe two. The rest of the night had been spent staring at the ceiling, cataloging every sensation behind her ribs, trying to separate the dying bond from the new one that shouldn't exist. She was elbow-deep in a repair job, carefully reattaching the spine of a 300-year-old agricultural census, when the door opened and a man she had never seen before stepped inside. He was lean and sharp-featured, with close-cropped copper hair and the kind of face that gave away nothing unless he wanted it to. His clothes were plain but well-made, and he moved with the quiet economy of someone trained to be unnoticeable. "Seren Lith?" he asked. "That depends on who's asking." "Oren Kassad, the king's beta." He glanced around the bindery with polite disinterest. "You're smaller than I expected. People usually are, when they're not standing next to the largest wolf in the known territories." The ghost of a smile crossed his face and vanished. "The king has requested your presence." Seren set down her bone folder with deliberate care. "He mentioned something about needing assistance. He was light on details." "His Majesty is light on most things," Oren replied. "Details, patience, social graces, you'll adjust." He held the door open for her. "If you'll follow me." The walk from the bindery to the king's working quarters took them through corridors Seren had never entered. The palace at Greyvault was ancient, a sprawling stone fortress whose hallways formed a maze that only lifelong residents could navigate. Oren walked quickly. Seren had to half-job to keep up. "Can you tell me anything about what this is regarding?" she asked his back. "No." "Can you tell me if I should be worried?" Oren glanced over his shoulder. "Are you the worrying type?" "Extensively and with great commitment." "Then yes, you should probably be worried." He paused at a heavy oak door and knocked twice. "But not for the reasons you're imagining." The door opened into a study that was larger than Seren's entire quarters. Bookshelves lined 3 walls from floor to ceiling, crammed with leather-bound volumes and rolled maps. A fire burned low in a massive stone hearth, and behind a desk, buried under paperwork, his head bent over a report, sat the king. He did not look up when they entered. Seren stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her, and tried to control the sudden hammering of her pulse. In daylight, without the ceremony and the crowd and the chaos, King Theron Ashvane looked different, not less intimidating. Less guarded, perhaps. She could see the dark hollows beneath his eyes more clearly. The tension in his jaw that never seemed to ease, and that slight tilt of his head again, angled toward the door as though listening to something she couldn't hear. "Seren Lith, your Majesty?" Oren announced. The king's pen paused. He looked up, and his gaze found her with that fraction of a second delay she had noticed the day before. He frowned, not at her exactly but at something. "Come closer," he said. Saren approached the desk. 3 steps. 4. 5. And she saw it happen in real time. The slight widening of his eyes, the way his shoulders dropped, a fraction, tension releasing like a breath held too long. His gaze sharpened, focused, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked at her with perfect clarity. "That's enough," he said. "Sit." There was a chair along the wall, positioned about 6 feet from his desk. Saren sat bewildered. "I'm going to continue working," the king said, already looking back at his papers. "You're going to remain in that chair." Saren waited for the rest of the instructions. "They didn't come? That's it?" she asked. "I just sit here." "Yes. For how long?" "Until I say otherwise." Syrian looked at Oren, who stood by the door with his hands behind his back and his expression carefully blank. He offered nothing. She settled into the chair. The king resumed writing. Minutes passed, the fire crackled, rain lashed the windows. Saren sat very still and tried to understand what was happening. The king worked steadily, reading reports, making notes in the margins, occasionally consulting a map pinned to a board beside his desk. He appeared to be functioning normally, more than normally in fact. He moved through the documents with sharp efficiency, his pen scratching confidently across the pages. An hour passed. 2 advisors came and went. The king discussed border patrols and grain tariffs and a dispute between 2 minor lords over water rights. His voice was clear, his decisions swift. He did not look at Surin once. But she noticed. Every time she shifted in her chair, his head tilted almost imperceptibly in her direction. When she crossed and uncrossed her ankles, his pen paused for half a beat. He was aware of her the way a man might be aware of a fire on a cold night, not staring at it, not acknowledging it, but oriented toward its warmth. After roughly 2 hours, Oren appeared at the door. "Your Majesty, the northern delegation has arrived." The king nodded and stood. He crossed the room, passing within a few feet of Saren's chair, and paused. "Thank you," he said, without looking at her. "I didn't do anything," Saren replied. Something flickered across his face, that ghost of exhaustion she had seen the day before. "Oren will escort you back." He hesitated, then added, "I'll need you again tomorrow," and likely the day after he left. Saren stared at the empty doorway, her mind racing. Oren waited until the king's footsteps had faded before speaking. "You can breathe now." "What just happened?" Saren demanded. The beta studied her for a moment, something thoughtful and careful in his expression. "You noticed a difference in him, didn't you, while you were here?" Saren thought about it. The sharpness that had entered his gaze when she'd approached the desk, the ease in his shoulders, the focused clarity of his work. "He seemed better," she said slowly. "Sharper. Like something had been weighing him down and it lifted," or nodded once. "The king requires your presence again tomorrow, same time, same arrangement." "You said that already. What you haven't said is why the beta moved toward the door. Because we don't fully understand it yet." He paused, one hand on the frame. "But I'd advise you not to mention this arrangement to anyone for his safety and yours." The chill that crawled down Saren's spine had nothing to do with the drafty corridor. "Is the king in danger?" she asked. Oren looked at her with an expression that was equal parts admiration and concern. "The king," he said quietly, "has been in danger for longer than anyone realizes. And yesterday in that wedding hall was the first time in over a year that anyone has seen him look truly well." He walked away before she could respond. Saren stood alone in the corridor, rain hammering the windows, and felt the twin threads pull in opposite directions, one toward the man who had chosen her sister, one toward the king who had, for reasons she could not begin to fathom, chosen her. 3 days passed each morning. Oren appeared at the bindery and escorted Saren to the king's study. Each morning, she sat in the same chair while the king worked. And each morning, the same thing happened. The moment she entered the room, something in him eased, sharpened, came alive. She started watching more carefully. On the first day, she thought she might have imagined it. On the second, she was certain. On the third, she tested it. She leaned forward in her chair, reducing the distance between them by perhaps 2 feet. The king was reading aloud from a treaty draft to his advisor, a sharp-tongued woman named Hadria, who seemed to disagree with everything he said on principle. Mid-sentence, his voice gained an edge of clarity it hadn't had before. His eyes tracked the words on the page with renewed precision. He caught a discrepancy in the text that he'd apparently overlooked twice already, Hadria noticed. Her gaze slid sideways to Saren, curious and suspicious. Later. Saren shifted her chair back. Not far, just a foot, within 10 minutes. The king paused mid-sentence. He frowned at the document, tilted his head, and reread the same line 3 times. Something wrong, Your Majesty? Hadria asked. No, the king said too quickly. A chill settled over Saren that had nothing to do with the room that evening. She found Vedra in the palace archives, surrounded by towers of crumbling manuscripts and the permanent smell of old ink. Vedra served as both head archivist and senior herbalist to the crown, a combination that made her either the most knowledgeable person in Greyvault or the most dangerously overworked. She was tiny and ancient, with white hair braided tight and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Vedra, Saren said, closing the door behind her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Vedra looked up from the manuscript she was translating. I'm always honest, child. It's one of my many exhausting qualities. Saren sat down across from her and told her everything. The wedding, the king's hand, the strange easing she had felt when he touched her, the 3 days of sitting in his study, the way he sharpened when she was close and dimmed when she moved away, the tilt of his head, the slight delay in his focus. Vedra listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with every word. When Saren finished, the archivist set down her pen and folded her hands. How much do you know about the siege of Ashenmere? Vedra asked. Saren blinked at the shift. The basics. The king broke the siege in 17 days. There were heavy losses on both sides. A settlement was destroyed. And the aftermath. A peace accord was signed. The border territories were absorbed into Valdren. Vedra shook her head slowly. That's the version they put in the chronicles. The truth is considerably worse. She rose from her chair and moved to a shelf in the far corner, pulling down a leather-bound journal so old its spine cracked when she opened it. There was a seer among the border folk, a woman named Ishara. She foresaw the siege and tried to negotiate a surrender before any blood was spilled. Saren leaned forward. What happened? The negotiation failed. Not because of the king, he wanted peace. But a faction within his own ranks, men who stood to profit from the territory being taken by force, sabotaged the talks. By the time the king discovered the betrayal, it was too late. The siege had already begun. Vedra turned a page in the journal. Ishara died in the assault, not in battle. She was crushed when the watchtower collapsed on the civilian shelter she was protecting. The king found her body afterward. Saren's chest tightened. With her last breath, Vedra continued, she spoke a curse. Not in anger, understand? In grief, the old texts describe these as lament, curses born not from hatred, but from sorrow. They're rare, and they're deeply destructive because the victim's own guilt feeds them. What was the curse? Saren whispered. Vedra met her gaze. You who did not see my people will lose all sight of your own. Your senses will dim, one by one, until the world itself abandons you. She paused. The king is going blind. Saren and deaf and numb. He's been losing his senses for over a year. And no one outside his inner circle knows. The room tilted. Saren gripped the edge of the table. That's why he tilts his head, she breathed. He's straining to hear. His hearing is the most degraded. Vision follows closely. Touch and taste have begun to fade as well. Fedra closed the journal. Orin and I have been searching for a countercurse since it began. Every remedy has failed. Every healer, every shaman, every scholar we've consulted, nothing reverses it. But he's better when I'm near him, Saren said, her voice rising. I've seen it. His eyes sharpen, his reactions improve. It's like he wakes up. Yes, Baedra said, her expression unreadable. We noticed. How long has he known about me? Since the wedding. Orin reported that the king's vision cleared completely the moment you took his hand. Completely, Saren. For the first time in 14 months. Saren pressed her hands flat against the table, feeling the grain of the wood against her fingertips, grounding herself. So this is why I'd been sitting in his study. He's using me as some kind of remedy. He wouldn't frame it that way. How would he frame it? He wouldn't frame it at all. The king barely acknowledges the curse exists. He would rather go blind and deaf in silence than admit to a single soul that he's vulnerable. Something in Saren's chest twisted. Not the dying bond, not the new thread. Something older, something that recognized the shape of someone carrying a weight they refused to share. The next morning, Orin led her to the king's private quarters instead of his study. Saren stopped in the corridor. I thought the arrangement was the study. The arrangement has been modified, Orin said, his expression giving nothing away. The king works from his rooms in the evenings. Your presence is required during those hours as well. His rooms, Saren repeated flatly. His sitting room, specifically. There's a desk, a chair, books. Orin paused. What exactly did you think I meant? Nothing, Saren said, far too quickly. Absolutely nothing at all. Orin raised one eyebrow. I just want to be clear, Saren continued, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, that I am here in a professional capacity, and whatever arrangement His Majesty requires, I will fulfill with propriety of any kind. The silence that followed hung in the air like a verdict. I'll pass that along, Orin said, with a restraint that suggested he was exercising considerable willpower. The king's sitting room was, as promised, a working space. A large desk dominated one wall covered in the usual chaos of documents and maps. Bookshelves flanked the fireplace. 2 chairs sat near the hearth, one clearly the king's and one newly added, still smelling faintly of furniture oil. And beyond the sitting room, through an open archway, Saren could see the edge of the king's bedchamber. A massive 4-poster bed, dark wood, dark linens. She looked away so quickly she nearly gave herself a neck injury. Theron was already at his desk when she entered. He glanced up, and she watched it happen again. The clearing, the sharpening, the way the world seemed to snap into focus for him the moment she crossed the threshold. His shoulders dropped. His grip on his pen eased, and for just a moment, his expression softened into something close to relief. Your chair, he said, nodding toward the hearth. Saren sat. The fire was warm. The chair was comfortable, far more comfortable than the one in his study. She noticed a small table beside it, and on the table, a stack of books. She picked up the top one, Restoration Tech for pre-Junification manuscripts. It was from the Palace collection, a text she'd been trying to access for months but had been denied because her apprentice rank didn't grant her archive privileges. These are for me? She asked, surprised. You mentioned an interest in pre-unification binding methods, the king said, not looking up. 3 days ago during a conversation I was not part of but unfortunately overheard. Saren stared at him. You were eavesdropping? My hearing is inconsistent, not absent. Occasionally, sounds I shouldn't be able to hear come through with perfect clarity. It's inconvenient. And you remembered a passing comment I made about bookbinding techniques. I have a good memory, he said shortly, and went back to his documents. Saren looked down at the book in her hands and bit her lip against a smile that had no business being there. That evening, after the advisors had come and gone and the fire had burned low, Seren sat reading while the king worked in silence. The room had grown dim, the candles guttering, and she noticed him leaning closer to his papers, squinting. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "shall I light more candles?" "No?" "The light is fading." I'm aware. She watched him struggle with the text for another 30 seconds, before standing and crossing to his desk. She picked at the candelabra from the side table and set it closer to his documents without asking permission. A muscle in his cheek flexed. "I didn't ask for assistance." "You didn't need to," Seren replied, then caught herself. She just corrected the king in his own chambers, while he was clearly trying to pretend he could see perfectly well. But instead of fury, something else crossed his face, that flicker again. The one that might have been amusement if it weren't buried so deep. "You're not afraid of me," he observed. "Should I be? Most people are." Saren considered this. Most people haven't watched you squint at a supply report like it personally offended you. It's hard to be terrified of someone who's clearly losing a fight against font size. The king stared at her, the silence stretched. Saren's heart hammered as she realized what she'd just said, to whom she'd said it, and precisely how far beyond the boundaries of acceptable behavior she had just launched herself. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. Just barely. Just enough. "You may go," he said, looking back at his papers. "Same time tomorrow." Seren gathered her things and moved toward the door. As she reached it, she heard him speak again, so quietly she almost missed it. "Thank you. For the candles." She didn't turn around. She didn't trust her face that night. Saren lay awake in her quarters, staring at the dark ceiling, when a sound pulled her upright. Not a sound from her room. A feeling. A vibration through the connection. Sudden and sharp, like a string plucked hard and left to resonate with distress. She was on her feet before she made the conscious decision to move. Down the corridor, up 2 flights of stairs, past the guards who recognized her now and let her pass without question. She reached the king's door and pressed her ear against it. Silence. Absolute, unbroken silence. She pushed the door open. The sitting room was dark, the fire dead, the candles out, and in the center of the room the king stood perfectly still. His eyes were open, wide and fixed, and staring at nothing. His hands hung at his sides. His chest rose and fell with shallow, rapid breaths. But he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react to the sound of the door opening or her footsteps crossing toward him. "Your Majesty," Seren whispered. Nothing? No response? No flicker of recognition. He was trapped somewhere. She couldn't see, locked inside his own body while the curse consumed what remained of his senses. She reached for his hand. The moment her fingers closed around his, she felt everything else fall away. The room, the cold, the dark, all of it narrowed to a single point of contact. His hand in hers, and somewhere beneath the stillness of his frozen body, a pulse of recognition so faint and desperate it nearly broke her. Saren didn't run to Vedra the next morning. She walked because running would have drawn attention, and attention was the last thing she needed after spending 10 minutes standing in the king's dark sitting room with her hand wrapped around his, watching the awareness slowly return to his eyes, like dawn breaking over a frozen landscape. He hadn't spoken when he'd come back, had simply looked down at her hand in his, then at her face, and the rawness of his expression had been so unguarded that she'd felt like she was seeing something she had no right to witness. "You should sleep, Your Majesty," she'd said. He had said nothing, but he hadn't released her hand. She'd stood there for another 5 minutes before his grip loosened and he stepped back, his walls reassembling themselves with visible effort. "Go," he'd said, and his voice had been rough and low and full of something she chose not to examine too closely now. In the cold clarity of morning, Seren sat across from Vedra in the archive and told her about the episode. His eyes were open, but he wasn't there. Seren said, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. It was like he'd been pulled out of himself. The silence takes him deeper at night, Vedra confirmed. When his defenses are down, during the day he fights it, at night it overwhelms. How often? Every night. Sometimes more than once, Seren absorbed this. And no one stays with him. No one is there when it happens. He won't allow it. Orn has tried. The king's personal guard has tried. He refuses company after dark. Vedra paused, studying Serene over her spectacles. Though he didn't refuse yours, Serene ignored the implication and pressed forward. When I touched him, he came back. It was immediate, like I pulled him out. Because you did. Vedra set down her own cup. Whatever connection exists between you and the king, it acts as an anchor. Your proximity sharpens his senses. Your touch appears to override the curse entirely, at least temporarily. So I should be with him at night, when it's worst. Vedra's expression shifted. That is a significant thing to offer. I'm not offering anything scandalous, Seren said quickly. I mean, being present in the room, available to help, if the episodes hit. I know what you meant, child. Vedra's tone was gentle. And I think you know that the king will resist the idea fiercely. He did? When Orin relayed the suggestion, the king's refusal was swift and absolute. No. The single word reached Seren through Orin's carefully neutral retelling, and still managed to sound like a door slamming, but the following night Seren felt the distress through the thread again, sharper this time. More urgent. She went to his door, and the guards let her pass, and she found him in the same state. Standing. Staring. Gone. She took his hand, and he came back, and this time, when he looked at her, there was something in his face that might have been defeat. You felt it, he said. Not a question. Yes, from your quarters. Through 2 floors and 100 yards of stone. Yes. He pulled his hand from hers and sat heavily on the edge of his desk. This should not be possible. And yet, a long silence. The fire was dying. Seren moved to the hearth and added a log without asking. The way she would have in the bindery, and when she turned back the king was watching her with that expression again. The one that looked like he was memorizing something he expected to lose. The chair by the fire, he said finally. You may use it on the nights when the episodes are severe. How will I know which nights are severe? He hesitated. You seem to know already. It started with 1 night, then 2, then every night because every night was severe, and they both knew it, and pretending otherwise was a waste of energy. Neither of them had a routine formed. Seren arrived after the palace settled, bringing her bookbinding tools and whatever project she was working on. She sat up by the fire while the king worked at his desk. They existed in parallel silence, sharing the same space the way 2 people might share a riverbank, aware of each other without needing to speak. But they did speak. Slowly, cautiously, in the way of 2 people who had each learned that vulnerability was a liability. It started with the books. Seren would mention something she'd read, a footnote about pre-unification cartography, or a marginal note left by a long-dead scholar, and the king would respond with a question that revealed he had read the same text years ago and remembered it in startling detail. You've read Aldrich's treatise on territorial sovereignty? Seren asked one evening, surprised. Twice. It's 600 pages long, I'm aware. It was poorly structured, but the analysis of border disputes in the 3rd section remains the most comprehensive work on the subject. The 3rd section is the most boring 200 pages ever committed to vellum. On that, the king said, we disagree. She told him about the bindery. About her mentor, a gruff, meticulous old man named Breslin, who had once accidentally bound a visiting dignitary's personal diary into a collection of agricultural records, and hadn't noticed for 3 months. How did he not notice? The king asked. Because the diary was incredibly boring, Seren said. Honestly, it improved the agricultural records. She watched for it, the slight softening around his eyes. the almost invisible twitch at the corner of his mouth. And when it came, she felt an entirely inappropriate surge of triumph. Making the king almost smile had become a private challenge. She refused to examine too closely. He never reciprocated with personal stories. He offered facts instead. Dry observations about palace operations, or historical details about the keep. Impersonal, safe, but occasionally something slipped through. "I used to read in this room when I was young," he said one evening, his gaze unfocused on the fire. "Before the war, before any of it. The chair you're sitting in was my mother's." Seren looked down at the chair. Worn velvet, faded green, the arms rubbed smooth by years of use. She'd assumed it was just old. Now it felt like something precious. She had good taste in chairs, Seren offered. That faint, almost smile appeared again. She had good taste in most things, except husbands. The silence that followed was heavy with things he clearly had no intention of elaborating on, and Seren let it rest. "Some doors you didn't push open. You just stood near them and let the person inside decide whether to turn the handle." Small gestures appeared. A blanket folded over the arm of her chair one evening. Thick wool, softer than anything she owned. A pot of tea that materialized on the side table, still hot, with a cup that matched the king's own set. "Thank you for the blanket," Seren said. "What blanket?" The king replied, in the exact tone of someone who knew precisely what blanket. "And the tea? The servants handle the tea?" "The servants don't know I'm here. You told me yourself that no one is to know about this arrangement." The tips of his ears went faintly red. Seren bit the inside of her cheek and returned to her book. She began reading aloud in the evenings. It started accidentally, when she muttered a passage under her breath and the king asked her to repeat it. Then it became intentional, because she noticed that when his vision faltered in the low light, her voice served as a different kind of anchor, not a cure for the failing sight, but a tether to hold on to while the world grew dim. She read from whatever she was working on: historical accounts, technical manuals, once an absolutely abysmal romance novel she'd found, wedged behind a shelf in the bindery. The king listened, without complaint, even to the romance. "That man has proposed marriage 4 times in 30 pages," the king noted dryly. "He's persistent, he's unhinged," says the man who asked a stranger to stand beside him at a wedding in front of 300 people. Dead silence. Seren's heart stopped. She'd gone too far, she'd actually gone too far this time, comparing the Alpha King of Valdrin to a fictional suitor in a terrible novel. "I asked once," the king said quietly, "not 4 times." Seren looked up from her book. He was watching her from his desk, and the firelight caught something in his expression that made her breath stall. Not amusement, not the guarded neutrality he wore like armor, something warmer. Something fragile and careful and entirely real. "You skipped a passage," he said. "What?" "Page 43. You always speed up when you're tired, and you jumped from the second paragraph to the fourth." Seren stared at him. "You've been counting my paragraphs? You've been counting my almost smiles." The accusation landed with surgical precision. Seren felt heat flood her face from her collarbone to her hairline. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, which was the most transparent lie she had ever spoken. The king held her gaze for one more moment, then looked away. "Good night, Seren. Good night, Your Majesty." She gathered her things and moved toward the door, her pulse roaring in her ears. As she reached the threshold, she felt the bond pull taut, felt the warmth of it flare and pulse with something that had nothing to do with curses or proximity or survival. He had been counting. He had noticed her the way she had noticed him. They had been orbiting each other in careful silence, cataloging each other's details, memorizing each other's patterns, building something neither of them was brave enough to name. She made it back to her quarters before the smile broke across her face, wide and helpless and terrified that night. The thread pulled her awake with such violence that she gasped and sat bolt upright, her heart slamming. The distress pouring through the connection was unlike anything she'd felt before, not the slow, suffocating withdrawal of the previous episodes. This was sharp, frantic, like a hand reaching through deep water and closing around nothing. She ran down the corridor, up the stairs, past the guards. The door was unlocked. She threw it open. The sitting room was empty. She crossed to the bedchamber. The king was in bed, his body rigid, his hands clenched in the sheets, his breathing shallow and ragged. His eyes were open, but whatever they saw, it wasn't this room. "Your Majesty," Saren breathed, reaching for his hand. The moment her fingers touched his, the floor disappeared beneath her feet. She plunged into blackness, absolute, total, consuming blackness. No light, no sound, no warmth, no scent, nothing. A void so complete that she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed, couldn't feel her own body, couldn't hear her own breath. She existed as nothing more than a point of consciousness suspended in infinite emptiness. And somewhere in that emptiness so faint she almost missed it, she heard him, not words, not speech. A sound that went beyond hearing, beyond language. The raw, wordless scream of a man who had been trapped in darkness so long he had forgotten there was anything else. Saren opened her mouth and called his name into the void. There was no ground, no sky, no walls, no air, no temperature. The void was not darkness in the way. A room without candles was dark. It was the absence of everything. Saren existed as a thought suspended in nothing, stripped of her body, her senses, her ability to orient herself in any direction. Panic surged through her, raw and animal, and she fought it down with everything she had. Because somewhere in this nothing, Theron was screaming, not with his voice. She couldn't hear sound here, but through the thread that connected them, she could feel it. A vibration so deep and anguished it bypassed her ears entirely and resonated in her bones, or where her bones should have been, in whatever part of her still existed in this place. She reached for the thread, not with her hands, because she couldn't feel her hands, but with something deeper intention, maybe. The thread was warm in the emptiness, the only warm thing. A thin golden line stretching from her chest into the infinite dark. Saren followed it. Time didn't exist here, she might have moved for seconds or hours, but slowly, gradually she became aware of him, not sight, not sound, just presence. A density in the void, a place where the nothing was less nothing. She pushed toward it, Theron. She thought his name with every ounce of force she possessed, and the void shuddered. She felt something solid beneath her feet, felt the cold rush in, and with it the distant smell of stone and ash. Felt her own hands, her own skin, the fabric of her nightgown against her legs. And then she could see him. He knelt on ground that wasn't ground, in a space that had formed around them like a bubble in deep water. His eyes were open and empty, his hands pressed flat against the floor, his shoulders rigid with the effort of enduring something she could not see. The void pressed against the edges of their small pocket of reality like hands against glass. Theron. She said it out loud this time, and the sound of her own voice was so startlingly real that she flinched. His head turned. Slowly, like a man moving underwater, his silver eyes found hers, and for a moment they were blank. Then recognition flooded in, and with it something so raw and desperate that Saren's heart cracked. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was rough and distant as though reaching her from very far away. "Neither should you." She knelt beside him and took his face in her hands. The moment she touched him, the pocket of reality expanded. The void retreated a fraction. She could feel warmth returning to the air, could hear her own breathing, could smell the faint trace of ink and leather that clung to his skin. His hands came up to cover hers. He was shaking. "Every night," she whispered. "This is where you go every night." He didn't answer, but the thread between them told her everything. Yes, every night. Hours of nothing, hours of being stripped down to bare consciousness and left in the dark with no way out. The curse didn't just steal his senses in the waking world. It dragged him here when he slept and buried him alive in emptiness. I can't always find the way back, he said quietly. Some nights it takes hours. Surin pressed her forehead to his. Then I'll find it for you. She closed her eyes, gripped the thread, and pulled. They woke gasping, both of them, lurching upright in the king's bed like drowning swimmers breaking the surface. The room was dark except for the dying fire, and for a moment they just breathed, ragged and harsh and very much alive. Saren's hands were still on his face. His were still covering hers. Neither of them moved. You pulled me out, he said, wonder and horror mingling in his voice. From inside? Yes. That's not possible. And yet, he stared at her, his silver eyes fully clear, fully focused, sharper than she had ever seen them. The curse's fog hadn't just lifted, it had been obliterated. She sensed it through the thread, every sense at full capacity, flooding back in a rush that made him wince and grip her hands tighter. It's too much, he breathed. And she realized that the sensory return was overwhelming him. After months of dimming sight and muffled sound, the world was suddenly, blazingly vivid. Your heartbeat, I can hear your heartbeat. Is that bad? It's very fast. You're holding my face and we're sitting in your bed in the dark. Of course it's very fast. Something shifted in his expression. The wonder remained, but beneath it, a heat that hadn't been there before. An awareness of her that went beyond gratitude, beyond necessity, beyond whatever clinical arrangement they had been hiding behind. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. Saren's breath caught. You should go, he said, and his voice had dropped to something low and rough that made her stomach tighten. Probably, she agreed, and didn't move. The thread between them pulsed, warm and insistent and undeniable. Saren felt her wolf stir beneath her skin for the first time since Kaelin's rejection. Not the agonized thrashing of a severed bond, but something new. Something that leaned toward the man in front of her with a certainty that terrified her. She pulled back. His hands fell away. The loss of contact was immediate and physical, a chill that swept through her despite the warm room. Same time tomorrow? She asked, trying for lightness, and missing by a considerable margin. Saren, her name in his mouth, did something complicated to her pulse. Good night, Your Majesty. She left before he could respond, before the look on his face could make her do something irreversible. And she didn't stop walking until she reached her quarters and closed the door and pressed her back against it and slid to the floor. Her wolf was howling, not in pain and recognition. The next morning she went to Vedra. I need to see the progression records. Saren said without preamble. Everything you've documented about the curse since it began. Vedra studied her for a long moment, then pulled a leather folio from her desk and laid it open. Charts, observations, dates, all written in Vedra's precise hand. Saren leaned forward and traced the timeline with her finger. The degradation of his senses followed a clear curve, hearing first, then vision, then touch, then taste, each declining steadily over the months. But in the last 3 weeks, since she had entered his life, the curve had changed. During her hours with him, the decline reversed. Outside those hours it accelerated. It's speeding up, Saren said, her blood going cold. When I'm not with him, it's getting worse faster than before. Yes, Vedra said, as though the curse is compensating for the time you spend counteracting it. So the more I help him, the harder it hits when I leave. That's one interpretation. Vedra paused, her expression troubled. One I've only just begun to confirm. Saren looked up. Tell me, the thread between you, the connection that allows you to enter the void and pull him out? Vedra met her gaze steadily. It runs both ways, Saren. If the curse can travel along his senses, there's nothing stopping it from traveling along the bond toward you. The words settled over Saren like ice water. You're saying the curse could spread to me. Vedra closed the folio. I'm saying it already has. The migraines you've been having, the difficulty concentrating when you're away from him, The way sounds seem muffled in the afternoons. She paused. You thought that was the rejected bond with Kalen causing those symptoms, didn't you? Seren's fingers curled against the folio. She had thought exactly that. It's not Kalen, Vedra said gently. It's the silence, and it's reaching for you through the very connection that lets you save him. The king found out on a Tuesday. Seren didn't know how. She suspected Vedra, though the archivist denied it with the inflappable calm of someone who had been keeping secrets for longer than most people had been alive. However it happened, the result was catastrophic. You are relieved of your duties, Theron said. They were in his study. Morning light fell across his desk in pale bands, and his face was carved from stone. No warmth. No almost smiles. Nothing but the rigid military composure of a king delivering an order he had no intention of reconsidering. Seren stared at him. My duties is what? Your human remedy. Your presence is no longer required. Because the thing that's killing you is now reaching for me, and you've decided the appropriate response is to send me away so we can both deteriorate separately instead of fighting it together. His jaw tightened. This is not a discussion. You're right, it's not. Because a discussion requires two people who are willing to listen, and you've clearly already decided to be noble and tragic about this. Something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Seren? Don't Seren me, her voice was shaking now. Anger and fear braided so tightly she couldn't separate them. You think pushing me away protects me? I can already feel it, Theron. The muffled sounds, the headaches. Sending me to the other side of the palace doesn't undo what's already happening. It just means we both suffer alone. He stood so abruptly his chair scraped back against the stone floor. I will not be the reason you lose your senses. I will not drag you into that void with me. You didn't drag me anywhere. I walked in. I chose to walk in. Then I'm choosing for you. His voice was low and final. You will return to the bindery. You will not come to my quarters. You will not come to my study, Oren will ensure it. The words landed like blows. Seren felt each one settle against her sternum, heavy and bruising, and beneath them the bond pulled so tight, it ached. And if I refuse, she whispered, then I'll have you removed from Greyvault entirely. The silence that followed was the worst kind. The kind that meant he was serious. The kind that meant he would rather destroy whatever was growing between them than risk it destroying her. Seren gathered her things with steady hands. She would not cry in front of him. She absolutely, categorically would not cry. She made it to the door before her composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for her voice to waver. You're wrong about this, she said without turning around. And by the time you realize it, I hope it's not too late. She left. The door closed behind her. She made it halfway down the corridor before the first tear fell. The days that followed were the worst of her life, and Seren had lived through the public humiliation of watching her fated mate marry her sister. So the bar was considerable. The connection didn't care about royal orders. It pulled constantly, a low, grinding ache beneath her ribs that intensified with every hour of separation. She couldn't eat properly, couldn't sleep. Her hands, usually steady enough to repair illuminated manuscripts with single hair brushes, trembled too badly to hold a bone folder. The symptoms Vedra had warned about worsened. Sounds grew muffled, as though someone had packed cotton into her ears. Colors faded at the edges of her vision. She burned her fingers on a candle flame and didn't feel it until she smelled the skin. Seren caught glimpses of the king. A tall shadow crossing the courtyard. His voice, distant and muffled, drifting from behind closed doors. Once, she turned a corner and saw him at the end of a long corridor, his hand braced against the wall, his head bowed, and the posture of defeat in his body made her stop breathing. He didn't look at her. Hadn't looked at her since the morning he'd sent her away. Oren found her in the bindery on the 5th day, and the expression on the beta's face told her everything she needed to know before he opened his mouth. How bad? Seren asked. He collapsed during a council meeting yesterday. lost all hearing for nearly 2 hours. He couldn't see the council members sitting 3 feet from him. Oren's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the fear beneath it. It's accelerating. Without you, the progression has tripled. I know. He won't let me tell you. You're telling me now. Because he's dying, Suren. The words fell any more quickly. Suren pressed her hands flat on the workbench to keep them from shaking. And me? As Vedra told you what's happening to me? She has. Then you understand that sending me away doesn't save either of us. It kills us both, just in separate rooms. Oren was quiet for a long moment. I understand, he said. On the 6th day, Milas came. Suren hadn't seen her sister since the wedding, but there she was in the bindery doorway, beautiful and poised in deep burgundy, her auburn hair pinned with jeweled combs. So, Malis said, her gaze sweeping the small workshop with undisguised contempt. This is where the king's pet hides. Suren set down the book she was repairing with deliberate care. What do you want, Malis? Her sister stepped inside, trailing her fingers along a shelf of binding supplies. Everyone is talking about you, you know. The foundling bookbinder who caught the Alpha King's attention at my wedding? She smiled, that same precise smile from the ceremony. Though I hear he's already tired of you. Sent you packing back here. Is there a point to this visit, or did you just miss being cruel to me in person? Malis's smile sharpened. I came to offer advice, sister to sister. She leaned against the workbench. Stop embarrassing yourself. The king doesn't want you. Kaelin didn't want you. Nobody wants the foundling. It's not a flaw in them. It's a flaw in you. The words were designed to wound. And once, they would have. Once, Saren would have absorbed them like a bruise, and carried them silently because Malis was older and prettier, and everything came easily to her. And maybe she was right. Maybe the flaw was in Saren, but that was before. Before the king's hand extended in a crowded hall, before she learned what it felt like to be needed. Before she crawled into an infinite void and pulled a man back from nothingness, because something inside her was strong enough to reach across the dark and hold on. You took my mate because you could, Saren said quietly. Not because you loved him, not because the bond called you, because I had something you wanted. And taking it from me made you feel powerful. Malis's expression flickered. But here's what you didn't count on. Saren stood, and she was shorter than her sister, had always been shorter, but in this moment she felt something in her spine straighten that had been bent for years. The bond you stole wasn't the real one. It was never the real one. And the thing that's happening between me and the king, the thing you came here to mock, is something you will never understand. Because it isn't about wanting. It's about choosing to walk into the dark for someone else, even when it costs you everything. Malis stared at her, for the first time in Saren's memory. Her sister had nothing to say. Please leave my bindery, Saren said. Malis left. Saren sat back down and her hands were shaking again, but not from the curse. From the aftershock of saying out loud the things she had carried silently for 23 years, that evening. Saren collapsed. She was walking from the bindery to the kitchens when the world tilted sideways without warning. Her vision went white, then gray, then nothing. She felt her knees hit the stone floor, felt the cold rush up to meet her, heard distantly someone shouting her name. When she woke, she was in the infirmary, and Vedra was beside her, holding her wrist and counting her pulse with grim concentration. Don't try to sit up, Vedra said. What happened? You fainted. And across the palace at the exact same moment, so did the king. Saren's blood went cold. What? The bond is synchronizing your deterioration. You collapse, he collapses. His senses fail, yours follow. Vedra released her wrist and sat back. You're dying in tandem, Saren. The curse doesn't care about walls and distance. It has the bond now, and it's using it. Then there's no point in staying away. There never was. Vedder's expression was the saddest Seren had ever seen it. I tried to tell him. I believe his exact response was an unprintable word followed by a royal decree that I mind my own business. Can the bond break the curse? Saren asked. If it were completed, if we sealed it fully, would our combined strength be enough? Vedra was quiet for a long time. In theory, a completed true mate bond is the most powerful connection a wolf can form. It binds two souls together at a level deeper than flesh. A lament curse feeds on guilt and isolation. A completed bond is the antithesis of both. So it could work. It could work, Vedra agreed. Or it could bind you so completely to him that when the curse takes him, it takes you with absolute certainty, instead of merely probable certainty. Those are terrible odds. They are the only odds you have. Vedra reached for her hand. He won't agree to it, child. He would rather die than risk you. Seren squeezed the old woman's hand. Then I won't ask his permission. Orin was waiting for her when she left the infirmary, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral, which by now Seren recognized as the beta's version of deep concern. Before you say anything, Seren started. The king collapsed in the war room, Orin said, lost all senses for nearly 4 minutes. When they returned, the first thing he asked was whether you were all right. Seren's throat tightened. He asked about me. He ordered me to check on you. Then he ordered me not to tell you he'd asked. Orin's mouth twitched. I'm choosing to interpret those orders selectively. I need to see him, I know. Orin unfolded his arms. There's something you should know first. Something the king won't tell you, because he believes it makes the situation worse. Seren waited. The curse didn't simply land on him like a stone falling from a height. Orin said, his voice low. It took root because he let it. Ishera's curse was a lament, powerful but not unbreakable. It should have weakened within months. Instead, it's grown stronger every day for over a year. He paused. Do you know why? His guilt, Seren said. He blames himself for Ishara's death. Not just Ishara, everyone. Orin's expression shifted into something heavy and personal, like he was sharing a grief that wasn't only the king's. The siege at Ashenmere was supposed to be a precision strike, limited casualties. In and out within a week. His voice hardened. Instead, the saboteurs in his ranks turned it into a massacre. 200 civilians died in the watchtower collapse alone. The king's own men disobeyed his orders, and he bears the weight of every death as though he swung the blade himself. That's not fair. No, but guilt rarely is. Orin met her gaze. The silence feeds on it. Every night the void shows him what he lost, what he failed to prevent, and every night he agrees with the punishment. He believes he deserves to lose the world because he couldn't save theirs. The parallel hit Seren with the force of a physical blow. A man who believed he deserved to lose everything, a woman who had spent her life believing she wasn't worth keeping. Two people, so convinced of their own unworthiness that they would rather suffer alone than reach for the hand extended in the dark. Get me into his chambers, Seren said. He'll be furious. He'll be alive. Orin steadied her for a moment. Then he nodded. Tonight, after the household retires, I'll leave the corridor clear. The palace was silent when Seren made her way through the upper corridors. No guards at his door, no Orin waiting to escort her. Just the cold stone and the flickering torchlight, and the bond pulling at her so hard she could barely breathe. She opened the door without knocking. The king's sitting room was dark. No fire, no candles. The air was cold and still, and for a terrible moment she thought the room was empty. Then she heard breathing. Shallow, labored, coming from the far corner, near the window. Theron, she said softly. No response. She moved forward, her bare feet silent on the stone floor, and found him sitting on the floor with his back against the wall beneath the window. His knees were drawn up, his arms resting on them, his head bowed. He was still dressed, boots and all, as though he had sat down at some point and simply been unable to get back up. She knelt in front of him. "Can you hear me?" "Nothing." His eyes were open, unfocused, staring through her at something that wasn't there. "Can you see me?" Not a flicker, the curse had him. Not fully, not the void, but somewhere between. A gray twilight where the world existed, as shadows and whispers, and nothing was clear enough to hold on to. Seren reached out and placed her hand against his cheek. The effect was instantaneous. His breath hitched. His pupils contracted, focused, found her face. She watched the world come back to him in real time, watched clarity flood his expression like water filling a glass, and when his eyes finally locked onto hers, the naked relief in them was staggering. "Seren," her name came out broken. "You can't be here." "I can. I am. I sent you away. You sent me away to protect me from a curse that's already reached me. My hearing is fading, Theron. My vision dims every afternoon. I burned my fingers 3 days ago and didn't feel it." She held up her hand, showing the pink mark across her fingertips. "Pushing me away didn't stop it. All it did was make sure we both suffered alone." His face contorted. She watched him absorb the information, watched the guilt land, watched it settle into the lines of his face like an old, familiar weight. "No," she said firmly, reading him with the accuracy of someone who had spent weeks memorizing every shift in his expression. "You don't get to take this on as your fault. I walked into the void of my own choosing. I sat in your study because I wanted to. I came back tonight because I need to be here, not because you forced me." "If the bond is sealed," he said, his voice rough, "and the curse takes me anyway, you'll die too. If the bond stays incomplete and the curse takes you, I'll die anyway." Vedra confirmed it. "We're already too connected for distance to save me." She moved closer, both hands on his face now, forcing him to look at her. "So the question isn't whether I'm at risk. I'm already at risk. The question is whether we fight this together or separately. I can't lose you," he said, and the words came out like they'd been torn from somewhere deep and raw and unprotected. "I have lost soldiers and allies and territory and my own senses, and I have endured all of it, but I cannot lose you. Then stop pushing me away. You don't understand." His hands came up, wrapping around her wrists, not pushing her away, but holding her there. "Before you, I was disappearing quietly. I could feel myself fading, sense by sense, day by day, and I had made peace with it because I thought I deserved it. And then you walked into that wedding hall with your heart breaking and your spine straight and your absolute refusal to collapse, and I felt something." His grip tightened. "For the first time in 14 months, I felt something." My vision cleared. I could hear the music. I could smell the flowers. I could feel the floor beneath my feet. And it was you. It was all you." Seren's eyes blurred with tears. "Then let me stay. If you stay," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "I don't think I can pretend anymore that this is just proximity, just an arrangement. I don't want you to pretend." "What do you want? You?" The word came out simple and true and terrifying. "I want you, not because the bond demands it, not because the curse requires it, because you remembered which books I wanted to read, because you counted my paragraphs, because you put your mother's chair by the fire for me, and pretended it meant nothing." He stared at her. She watched the last of his defenses crumble, watched the walls he had built from guilt and duty and self-punishment collapse like structures that had been hollowed from within, and what remained beneath them was so tender and bare and real that it stole her breath. He kissed her, not gently, not carefully. He pulled her forward, and his mouth found hers with a desperation that spoke of months of restraint shattering all at once. Seren kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands sliding into his hair, her body pressed against his, and the thread between them blazed so bright she could feel it in her teeth. He made a sound against her mouth, low and broken, and pulled her closer. His hands spanning her waist, her ribs, the curve of her back. Everywhere he touched, her skin came alive, and she knew through the bond that the same was true for him. Every point of contact was a sense restored, a color returned, a sound made clear. "If we do this," he breathed against her lips, "there's no going back. I don't want to go back." He lifted her as though she weighed nothing, and he carried her through the archway into the bedchamber, his mouth never leaving hers. The bed met her back, and he settled beside her, pulling her close, and the world narrowed to heat and breath and the overwhelming rightness of being exactly where she belonged. What followed was overwhelming in the way that only surrendering to something inevitable can be. Every whispered word, every shared breath, drew the bond tighter between them. Saren felt the connection expanding, weaving itself into something broader and deeper, binding them at a level that went beyond skin and bone and breath. When the moment came, when the bond demanded its completion, Theron's teeth found the curve of her neck, and his bite sent a shockwave through her that lit up every nerve she possessed. The bond snapped into place with an almost audible force, golden and blazing and utterly complete, binding them together so thoroughly that for one breathless moment she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. She bit him back, felt his groan vibrate through her, felt the bond answer, doubling back on itself, sealing tight, complete. They lay tangled together afterward, breathing hard, his forehead pressed to hers. Everything poured through the bond. His heartbeat, his exhaustion, his overwhelming relief, and beneath it all, a love so fierce and absolute that it made her eyes sting. "The wind," he whispered. His voice was full of quiet wonder, but also disbelief, as though he expected it to vanish at any moment. "I can hear the wind outside." He kissed her forehead. "Thank you." "For what?" "For walking into the dark." His arms tightened around her. "For refusing to leave me there." Sleep pulled at them both, irresistible after weeks of deprivation. And Seren let it come. She closed her eyes, pressed against his chest, the bond humming between them like a hymn. She woke in the void, but this time everything was different. Theron was beside her, his hand in hers, the bond between them burning gold in the blackness. And ahead of them, visible for the first time, a shape in the nothing, a figure standing motionless in the dark, watching them with eyes that glowed like dying embers. When it spoke with Ashar's voice. "So," the seer said, "you've come at last." The void was different with him beside her. Before, it had been absence total, suffocating emptiness that stripped her of everything and left her formless in the dark. But now, with the completed bond blazing between them, like a lantern held against infinite night, the nothing had edges, boundaries. The blackness wasn't infinite anymore. It was a room, a cage, and they were standing inside it together. Theron's hand tightened around hers. She could feel him through the bond, fully and completely for the first time. Not fragments of emotion leaking through an incomplete thread, but everything. His fear, sharp and controlled. His guilt, deep as bedrock, his determination, fierce and bright, and woven through all of it, his love for her. So vast and certain that it made her chest ache with something that was the opposite of pain. Ishara stood before them. She looked nothing like Seren had imagined. Not a vengeful witch, not a snarling spirit with blood on her teeth. She was young, younger than Seren, with dark skin and gentle eyes and braided hair that fell past her shoulders. She wore a simple dress, and her bare feet rested on ground that wasn't ground. She looked tired, not angry, not hateful, just profoundly, achingly tired. "You sealed the bond," Ishara said, and her voice echoed strangely in the void, as though it were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I wondered if you would. You knew about the bond?" Saren asked. "I knew it was the only thing that could bring you both here willingly." Ishara's gaze moved to Theron. "I've been waiting a long time, King." Theron's jaw was tight, his body rigid beside Seren's. The guilt surged through the bond, rising like floodwater, and with it came images. Not memories she could see, but memories she could feel, pouring through the connection between them with brutal clarity. The march on Ashen Mere. The careful plans for a limited engagement, the surgical precision of the strategy, and then the horror of watching it unravel. His own commanders disobeying orders, the assault expanding beyond its boundaries, the watchtower buckling under bombardment that was never supposed to reach the civilian district, and Ishara running through the chaos with her hands raised, shouting for a crute that no one could hear over the bombardment. The sickening moment when the tower came down, the dust, the silence, the terrible, terrible silence that followed. Theron finding her body in the rubble, kneeling beside her, feeling her last breath against his hands as she spoke the words that would chain them both to this darkness. Seren's eyes filled with tears, not her grief, his, pouring through the bond, like water through a broken dam, 14 months of guilt and self-punishment, and the absolute conviction that he deserved every second of the silence. "I failed you," Theron said to Ishara. His voice was stripped bare. No armor, no composure, nothing but a man standing before the consequence of his deepest regret. "I should have seen the sabotage sooner, should have been there when the tower fell, should have done more." "Should have what?" Ishara asked, and her voice was gentle in a way that cut deeper than anger ever could. "Should have held the tower up with your hands. Should have stopped a war with your body. Should have been everywhere at once, saving everyone, failing no one." Theron flinched. "You aren't a god," Ishara said. "You are a king trying to end a war. And the war did what wars always do. It ate the people who didn't deserve it." The void shifted around them. The darkness rippled. And suddenly, they were standing in Ashen Mere, or a memory of it. Stone cottages with smoke curling from their chimneys, children playing in a dusty square, the watchtower rising tall and whole against a blue sky. Saren watched Theron's face as he took it in. The village he had never seen intact. The people he had only known as casualties. "I didn't curse you because I hated you," Ishara said. She stood in the center of the village square, and around her the ghosts of Ashen Mere moved through their daily lives, unaware of the future bearing down on them. "I cursed you because I was dying and I was afraid, and grief does terrible things to people who have the power to give it teeth." "You had every right," Sharon said. "No," Ishara's voice sharpened. "I didn't, and that's what I've been waiting to tell you." She stepped closer, and the village shimmered around her. "The curse was wrong, Theron. It was born from pain, not justice, and it trapped me here, just as surely as it trapped you." Saren's breath caught. "You're trapped too." Ishara turned to her with a sad smile. "A lament curse binds the speaker and the target. I can't rest until he releases the guilt that feeds it, and he can't release the guilt because he believes he owes me his suffering." She looked back at Theron. "You don't. You never did." The village began to dissolve at the edges, the buildings turning to mist, the ghostly figures fading. Theron stood rigid, his hands clenched, his entire body vibrating with the effort of holding himself together. Saren stepped forward and took both of his hands in hers. "Look at me," she said. He did. His silver eyes were raw, red-rimmed, stripped of every defense he had ever built. "I spent my entire life believing I was abandoned because I wasn't enough," Saren said, and the words came from a place so deep and true that speaking them felt like pulling thorns from her own chest. "My parents left me on the castle steps. My sister took my mate and smiled about it. And for 23 years, I told myself the same story, that I was the common thread, that if I had been better, prettier, more, none of it would have happened." She squeezed his hands. "But it was never about me being enough. My parents made their choice for reasons I'll never know. Malis made hers out of cruelty and ambition. None of it was a verdict on my worth, and Ashenmere wasn't a verdict on yours. People died because of my decisions." Theron said, his voice cracking. People died because of a war that other men engineered. You tried to prevent it, you failed. And that failure will always hurt, and it should. But living in the punishment doesn't bring them back. Seren pressed her forehead to his. It just keeps you and Ishara both in chains. She felt the moment it broke, not the curse, not yet. Something inside him, the iron certainty that he deserved, the darkness, the belief so deep and old it had become part of his foundation. She felt it crack through the bond, felt the sharp, agonizing pain of it giving way. And then the flood that followed 14 months of suppressed grief, pouring out of him in a sound that was more animal than human. He fell against her, his arms wrapping around her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she held him. She held him the way she'd wanted to hold him since the first night she'd seen him standing frozen in the dark, and she didn't let go. When he spoke, it was to Ishara, and his voice was wrecked. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not because I owe you suffering, because you deserved better. All of you deserved better." Ishara closed her eyes. Something in her face released, a tension that had been held for over a year, and when she opened her eyes again, they were clear. "Build something worth their sacrifice," she said. "That's all any of us ever wanted." The bond between Seren and Theron blazed. Golden light erupted from the thread connecting them, pouring outward in a wave that filled the void like sunrise filling a valley. The darkness shattered. The village of Ashenmere dissolved into warmth and light. Ishara smiled, a real smile full of relief and peace and exhaustion, and she came apart like ash in a warm wind, gently, willingly, finally free. Seren woke in his arms, in his bed, in the warm amber light of a fire that had burned down to its last embers. Theron was awake beside her, his face wet, his eyes wide and clear and blazing with a clarity she had never seen in them before. "I can hear the wind," he whispered. "The servants in the corridor below, the hounds in the courtyard, the rain on the roof, 3 floors above us." His hand came up to cup her face trembling. "I can see the flecks of gold in your eyes, the freckle beneath your left ear, the thread where your sleeve was mended." Seren laughed through her tears. "That's a lot of detail. I can feel everything." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "The weave of the sheets, the heat of the fire. Your pulse under my fingers?" His voice broke. "I can feel everything, Seren." She pulled him close and held him while he wept. Not from grief, this time. From the overwhelming, devastating relief of a man who had been locked in a silent, sightless prison for 14 months and was finally impossibly free. "I've got you," she whispered against his hair. "I've got you." He held her tighter, and they stayed like that as the fire burned low and the rain fell softly against the windows, and the world, vivid and loud and beautifully painfully real, continued around them. The curse didn't vanish without a trace. Theron still flinched at sudden loud noises, his body bracing for the silence that no longer came. Some mornings he woke, reaching for her in a panic, convinced for one terrible heartbeat that his hands would feel nothing on those mornings. Seren took his face in her hands and waited until his breathing steadied and his eyes focused on hers and the panic drained away, replaced by the quiet, bone-deep gratitude of a man who still couldn't quite believe his senses would stay. Healing, they learned, was not an event. It was a practice, daily and imperfect, and sometimes frustrating, like binding a book with a cracked spine. You could only work with patience and steady hands and the faith that the structure would hold. The court's reaction to a foundling bookbinder standing beside the Alpha King was exactly as complicated as Seren had expected. The whispers followed her through every corridor and council chamber. The looks, the barely concealed disdain from nobles who believed bloodline determined worth. She felt the weight of all of it, every day. But Theron was immovable. "If anyone takes issue with my mate," he told the assembled court on the day of their formal bonding ceremony, "they are welcome to raise the matter with me directly." He paused, and the silence that followed was the productive kind. "I'll wait." Nobody raised the matter. Saren kept working in the bindery. This was non-negotiable. She was the Alpha King's mate, but she was also a bookbinder, and she would not stop being one simply because her title had changed. The bindery became her sanctuary, the place where her hand remembered who she was before any of this had happened, and who she still was beneath it. The bond to Kaelin dissolved quietly like ice, melting in spring. She barely noticed when it finally disappeared. Whatever the moon had intended when it paired them, it had been overruled by something deeper. Malus could keep what she had taken. Seren had something her sister would never understand. Months later, on an evening so ordinary it shouldn't have mattered but did, Saren sat in the faded green chair by the fire in the king's chambers. A half-bound manuscript rested in her lap. Her tools were spread across the side table, alongside a cup of tea that had gone cold because she always forgot to drink it while she worked. Theron sat at his desk, reading. The fire crackled. Rain tapped gently against the windows. The bond between them hummed, golden and steady, and the room was warm with a quiet that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with peace. He looked up from his papers. She looked up from her binding. "You're staring," she said. "You skipped a stitch." "I did not skip a stitch. I have never skipped a stitch in my life." Third row, left side. Seren looked down, examined the binding with narrowed eyes. He was right. She would die before she admitted it. "Good night, Theron," she said, biting back a smile. "Good night, Seren." She went back to her book. He went back to his papers. The fire burned low, the rain fell soft, and outside the windows of Greyvault, Keep the World turned quietly onward, and for the first time and longer than either of them could remember, everything was exactly as it should be.